In January 2021, a transgender student wrote a Reddit post detailing how the Ministry of Education, or the MOE, had allegedly interfered with her hormone therapy. The student was diagnosed with gender dysphoria in 2019 and was to undergo treatment as she turned 18. However, her doctor called off the treatment, informing her that the MOE had intervened, affecting her ability to present as a female. Despite the post being made on the then small subreddit SG Exams, which was mainly for students and young adults studying in Singapore, the post quickly gained attention as it went viral on other social media platforms. To this date, the post is still the most upvoted post of all time on the subreddit. What was initially a rant on a throwaway account became a civil society debate, starting with alternative media outlets picking up the story and subsequently catching the attention of mainstream media. Responses to the post include a statement of solidarity from over 50 LGBTQ organizations, a statement of support from more than 600 individuals, and a 5-person protest outside of the MOE building, which was quickly escorted away in 30 minutes. Although there was response from the government, including a joint statement from the MOE and the Institute of Mental Health, IMH, and a parliamentary response by the then Minister for Education, these were seen as inadequate non-responses, essentially sidestepping the crux of the issue. This video you're watching, which is probably already stupidly long, is not going to cover the details. Rather, I'm interested in the fact that there was such a big response. LGBTQ issues have always not been well discussed in Singapore, and these non-answers from official government sources have always been the norm. Estimates for the population of the LGBTQ people in a country can be anywhere from, 1 to 10%. The story is certainly not an uncommon one, even if it's not officially recognized or discussed. But even beyond some kind of non-conforming gender identity, I think a lot of people can sympathize with people who feel misplaced or misunderstood by society. And to those people, it can feel like there is a bit of a culture war. And I mean the phrase in the sense that there are groups of people who struggle to impose their ideology upon their society. And given that they feel silenced and ignored, hence the saying,
"There's no war in Ba Sing Se."
And, well, this isn't only felt by the LGBTQ community. A lot of things that happened after that certainly didn't help, like the case of the police officer Uva Rajagopal who killed himself, alleging racism, bullying and misconduct by his superiors and peers over the years, the corruption charges to the transport minister, the Redoubt Road saga bringing into question the ministerial code of conduct and preferential treatment, and a spit in the face to Singaporeans facing increasing property prices and decreasing living space. What I'm trying to say is that there is a non-insignificant population in Singapore primed to be wary of official sources, particularly those from the government, where they feel like their issues will not be treated seriously. And let me show you what this is manifesting as. In 2019, a video of a man shouting at some condominium security guards received a lot of attention online. Angry over the parking fee, he was told to pay for his guests to park inside the condo. The man shouted vulgarities at the security guard and noted that he paid 1.5 million Singapore dollars for his apartment, saying that it is not a HDB flat.
Madam, you're not staying in a HDB, no?
Apparently angry that there was such rules even for Deepavali. The man wasn't really committing a crime, and honestly, the video isn't much different from other Karen videos out there. But the man, who was assumed to be foreign talent due to his accent, talking about wealth and comparing properties to Singaporean workers, was something that locals did not take well to. And to make things worse, the services of the security agency were terminated. Even with zero context for the before or after the video, speculation went wild as netizens dug up payslips and LinkedIn accounts, prank-called the man, called for him to be deported, and set up a petition to get him fired from his job. Turns out, the payslips and LinkedIn account belonged to people who just happened to have the same name. The services of the security agency were also changed for a completely unrelated reason. The man was also a Singaporean, although he obtained his citizenship by marrying a Singapore-born citizen. Despite the man apologizing to the security officer and the security forgiving him, even nearly 5 years later, there are still people trying to stir shit for this case. Like, this shit doesn't happen for no reason. People just feel like the government isn't doing enough, and that's why they want to make things happen themselves. Angry condo man just happened to be there at the wrong time, and all the frustrations from the government sidestepping and downplaying the immigration problems found the target. The thing is, people who try to act Batman in real life Forget they are not superhero detectives. Just a little whoopsie falling for fake news and doxing people. Instead of, checking the facts and letting the functioning police and legal system determine if punishments were necessary. This kind of online mob justice doesn't happen without the erosion of public trust. And when people find that they cannot trust official sources, they turn to garbage sources like Facebook, TikTok, and YouTube. Those exact sources people use to justify harassing a man who just happened to be angry for a few minutes. And on YouTube, there is this video by a YouTuber called Elliot Sang, where the title is Singapore, the real Ba Sing Se. In terms of its messaging and framing, this video is tailor-made for that population of people who don't trust official sources and are less media literate. Like those young people who we initially thought were tech-savvy but turn out to be the demographic more likely to fall for scams and fake news. So finally, all 1000 words of context just to explain to you why people will believe the bullshit in this video. Some might be inclined to believe that a 50-minute video will mean that there is some good effort behind it. But to me, who knows how long these types of videos take to make and also how long it takes to make videos shorter, it reads like the opinion of someone who only started learning and researching Singapore for a week and then wrote an essay about it, which is, coincidentally, the same amount of time between their previous upload. Elliot Sang does raise valid criticisms of Singapore and the politics of Lee Kuan Yew, but the video makes a lot of hasty generalizations, misunderstands statistics, omits the entire range of logical fallacies, and misleads the audience using common propaganda techniques. To address those arguments, I will be doing a reaction video. But it is not a true reaction video as I have watched the video many times beforehand. And I'll be honest, a face review is a bit of a risk, since I do feel that the people behind the video are possibly just stupid ignorant shitfluencers, but also possibly nut jobs. And they have possibly 6 digits worth of fans who watched this garbage and decided subscribing was the right choice. And they also happen to tickle the algorithm a little bit happier so they make YouTube more money. I'm going to be playing their video on 1.5 speed, but first, for those who don't watch Avatar, what even is Ba Sing Se? Ba Sing Se is a fictional city in the American animated series Avatar: The Last Airbender. It is the capital city of the Earth Kingdom and is also known for being impenetrable partly due to its walls, which are opened by earthbending. To people outside the city, Ba Sing Se is a peaceful utopia that is also isolated from the world. For fans of the show, mentioning Ba Sing Se would bring to mind 2 things. This creepy smiling lady welcoming the Ang gang, and the brainwashing segment.
There's no war in Ba Sing Se.
What are you talking about? Where do you think all the refugees come from? You can't hide it.
In the show, the gang goes to the city to find their missing friend and warn the Earth King. And as they quickly found out, the city isn't the utopian city as people believed. They found themselves unable to do anything in the city, with their request to meet the king being ignored by their assigned guide. Any information they could gather was also being sanitized. In order to preserve the culture and peace, any mention of war is forbidden in the city, and people who so much as speak about it in casual conversation are captured and brainwashed. Ba Sing Se is also segregated into districts with separate social classes, with great inequality in the city. It is pretty obvious that Ba Sing Se is based on China, with the Great Walls and Royal Palace based on the Forbidden City. The separation of social classes is similar to how emperors planned cities during the dynastic periods. Aside from that, it also resembles the later dynasties where the country is ruled from behind the scenes by the emperor's servants. The Tai Li in Ba Sing Se is pretty much the same as the embroidered uniform guard or the Jing Yi Wei. And now that you know what Ba Sing Se is, let's begin by skipping the 1 minute 24-second padding intro.
Singapore, what do you know about it? So young adults in the West, like myself, I'm 27, are looking to move away from big cities, especially in America and places like London, where cost of living is becoming too high. Rent is getting too damn high. Some of us can go back to countries where we have ancestral roots, especially if we have family there or if we speak the dominant language. Others may look for quaint cities, championed by urban planning YouTubers, stressing the importance of walkability and public services. Of course, there's also these socio-political factors that make living in the first world less and less Exciting, the unabashedly evil nature of political leaders and their decisions that lead to violence and poverty, the connection to colonialism which builds wealth at the expense of the exploited third world. It's popular now for Gen Z folks who are left-leaning, to try to look around towards other places in the world, ones that seem to meet a rational standard of living and equity. Enter Singapore.
Okay, I know there aren't any actual arguments here yet, but Singapore is also a city and it's also one of the most expensive places to live. You can find this information already on the first page of search. On the Economist Intelligence Unit list, it's the top for the 9th time in 11 years. On this more dubious World Population Review site, Singapore is also top 10 here, above the United States. Although the cost of living index by Numbeo is about 10 index points lower than New York. On this 2020 article by Business Insider, they cite a Go Banking Rates article which is now updated as of 2023 to have Singapore at the top spot. And here, they clearly state that Singapore's rent is $3,000 a month, and its cost of living is more than 14% higher than the US average. So, I have no idea why Elliot Sang is looking at Singapore when the first thing they complain about is rent and wanting to move away from the city. Normally, this is the time I close the video because the authors clearly didn't do even the most basic of research. Or perhaps this was a deliberate choice of the script to filter out people like me to make sure that the audience is someone who isn't paying attention or someone who just doesn't understand much about Singapore.
Singapore's global reputation is as a country where you should probably live instead. Public services are strong, people are healthy, the population is multiracial, there's a lot of booming businesses there. It's one of the most important areas in the world for fiber optic submarine cables, did you know that? The climate is warm, the beaches are really nice, and on top of that, English is spoken everywhere.
Lo que es genial para los que no quieren aprender otro idioma.
Honestly, with how shit things are in New York right now, I'd probably love living in Singapore instead, although I'm not sure they'd let me do so after making this video.
I mean, okay, the footage he's showing here comes from Visit SG, which is an initiative by the Singapore Tourism Board. Colors are like this because of dark mode. Every country wants to have a good reputation for diplomacy, but it's even more so for tourism purposes. That is very different compared to living here, and I assume that means migrating here. They mentioned New York, so let's see the official site for New York tourism. It's the same thing. Delicious eats, iconic sites, easily accessible transportation, and the world's most welcoming city. I dislike marketing as much as any other person. Still, you can't use tourism marketing materials, as it is going to have that utopian slant. It's meant to invite you for a holiday. And maybe it's just me. I could just be irritated, because I've watched this video so many times. But the way he speaks sounds very self-centered. Let me consolidate why I think so, just in case I'm wrong. They are looking to move to another country, not because they like that country or because they have to be there, but because they just think their first world country home sucks. 2. They don't want to learn another language. That's what it writes there. They didn't phrase it to say, the country already speaks English, which means it's easier for me to assimilate into its culture. They chose to phrase it, I don't want to learn another language. 3. They seem to think that you can just move anywhere in the world. So here's the thing. Countries do care if you can contribute to the economy and integrate into their society. They want to attract talent that will benefit the native population rather than invite in someone who will take away something. Especially if that place is a population-dense country like Singapore. And yes, population density by country doesn't seem accurate because I'm not comparing cities. But for Singaporeans, we have nowhere outside of the city to go. That is not the case for someone, say, living in a dense city in France, where they have more freedom to move out of the city temporarily or even to other EU countries. That's the reality of having limited space in a country. Like this photo, taken by this Redditor on the 21st story of the building Capital Sky, is almost half the length of Singapore. That's how small the country is. You can't just expect to squeeze in just because you suddenly have the urge to move. And of course, if you do something like, say, mock the poor in a country and call taxi drivers tart, or do something like threaten their president, something that will be relevant later, among a pool of suitable candidates, why would any country choose someone like that? Why would any country reserve resources to give to someone whose first reaction to their shitty living condition is to choose another country to escape to? Why would any country want someone who doesn't have any loyalty, doesn't even like the people, or even wants to understand the culture?
Because I have to say, beneath all this utopian imagery is a far more familiar and dark reality. One where civil liberties are repressed, marginalized people are oppressed, and the class of elites exploit a silenced underclass. This is Singapore.
I would say that Singapore is in for a reckoning, Singapore is in for a root shock, and we are going to have to do a lot of work. Our generation is going to have to do a lot of work to rebuild this society back from where it got knocked down. A lot of the people responsible for these fix-ups, be it the Christian far right, be it the Muslim far right, be it the other far right entities, be it the Internal Security Department, they have knocked down Singapore's society down to its knees, and it's up to the people of Singapore to build it back up on its feet.
Okay, first of all, who the fuck is this? Did they just do the trust me bro, sauce is my friend thing? I do not want to know who this is, and trust me, you don't. Skip a sponsor spot. Then they do the video essay thing by talking about a popular narrative history where Lee Kuan Yew plays a big role. The key point here is the framing, since they'll be blaming Lee Kuan Yew for a lot of things. Although Elliot Sang goes back to the 1300s, most of those history is just stated as is without context, thereby becoming irrelevant to the topics we have. So for instance, he'll talk about Singapore's size, but don't put it into context where it may be relevant for, say, national defense or immigration. I think fact-checking this portion is a waste of time, so I'm just gonna assume you have some general knowledge about Singapore. Let's continue here.
His reign over several decades led to it becoming the shining city it is today. And so Lee Kuan Yew brought Singapore from third world to first. A peaceful place, full of prosperity. There is no war in Singapore. There is no war in Singapore. There is no war.
You're either born bright, energetic, skillful, or you're born not so bright, not so energetic, not so skillful.
So that's the popular narrative. Lee Kuan Yew is like the Jordan Peterson of 20th century Asian politicians. r/brand new sentence. He has become renowned on YouTube as an orator, as a guy with killer quotes, as an absolute ledge that may have done a little political repression here and there, but he did it because he had to.
Even if you are going to lower me into the grave and I feel that something is going wrong, I'll get up.
It was all for the best, keeping Singapore stable, fair, and safe. Well, stable is kind of a subjective idea, but let's talk about fairness, meritocracy. I want to start by sharing a quote of his that may not be as well known, although it has a fair amount of upvotes on goodreads.com, so I'll assume that people know it a little bit. I think it shares a significant insight into his philosophy and the state of Singapore today. Lee said,
I started off believing all men were equal. I now know that's the most unlikely thing to ever have been, because millions of years have passed over evolution. People have scattered across the face of this earth, been isolated from each other, developed independently, had different intermixtures between races, peoples, climates, soils. I didn't start off with that knowledge. We were faced with the reality that equal opportunities did not bring about more equal results.
So what's interesting about that quote, first of all, is a weird conflation of equal with similar or the same. Like, sure, people are different because they're born in different places. That does not mean that they're not equal in the sense that the phrase all men are equal was coined to mean, right? Right? Let's start here. Remember that one clip of Anthony Bourdain when he was in Singapore?
The political oppression is true, but I'm confused. Did they not read any context for this quote before using it? Elliot Sang is trying to use this quote to talk about inequality in Singapore, specifically to lead to the next Anthony Bourdain clip, in a way using this quote to explain that Lee Kuan Yew has a philosophy that people are not equal, as in, all men are not created equal. But the original quote that you can find in this book was about the realities of cultural differences and how they shaped different groups of people. If you just go to the chapter where this is from, it says, Culture, the X factor. Lee Kuan Yew looked at cultural differences and wanted an answer to what those cultural differences meant in societies. How come certain ethnic groups were more driven in the pursuit of material wealth? What explains the dominance of some races? Why Nobel Prize winners tend to be Ashkenazi Jews rather than Sephardi Jews? How come Buddhism feels different in Japan? And the reason for doing this, again, was not because Lee Kuan Yew was trying to argue that some people deserve different rights. It was because Singapore had a wide variety of cultures, and he needed to understand if there were any practical effects on the country. Like, why was there a disproportionate number of Teochew Chinese and Hakkas in the cabinet? How come Malays tend to perform less well than other ethnic groups? So in the case of Malays, because of different cultural values of what success means, Malays tend to want to continue traditions, as opposed to the Chinese majority who saw wealth as success. That means in a capitalistic world, Malays are usually seen as less successful. There is nothing wrong if a Malay doesn't want that kind of success, but that cultural difference also means that Malays have a higher chance of struggling due to financial reasons. And to reduce inequality, not increase it, there is, as an example, free education for Malays from primary school to university. Later on, Lee Kuan Yew also clarifies, "I'm not as smart as an Israeli or many Chinese for that matter. But that doesn't mean that I'm not to be treated as equal in my rights as a human being." And a few more paragraphs later, "So my attitude now would be a very practical one of saying that we are equal human beings. Whether you can run 100 yards in 20 minutes, 20 seconds, or 10 seconds, you've got a right to be here. But that doesn't mean that because you run at 20 seconds, I must run at 20 seconds. Then we'll all get nowhere." Lee Kuan Yew does have controversial views on eugenics, which is something we get to a bit later. But if there is a philosophy Singaporeans got from Lee Kuan Yew, it is pragmatism, not whatever Elliot Sang is assuming for the passing say narrative. Elliot Sang does something malicious from 15 minutes to 20 minutes of their video. But to understand what's wrong with the argument, we have to tackle every single detail here. In Boudin's documentary, these three are just one clip among the various clips with different Singaporeans we see. So it's super clear that they may not be representative of the population. That is not the case in Elliot Sang's video, where we finally see what a modern Singaporean looks like. Immediately, the framing becomes different. The first thing to clarify is that the accents of these three suggest English-educated household, which usually means their parents had higher incomes or inherited wealth. But to clarify, using accent to judge SES won't work as well today because people are more exposed to international media and can code switch better. This lady asked if Boudin sent laundry to the butler, which is not a normal thing to ask because only rich people hire butlers. Whereas for maids, you can imagine even a middle-income household hiring one for reasons like, say, a single-parent household, or if they need someone to take care of their parents with certain medical conditions while they are working. That said, most households don't have domestic helpers. According to official statistics, there are about 280,000 domestic workers. That's the work permit MDW there. So with 1.4 million households, that's 1 in 5 households. In reality, it's probably even less than that because some higher income households will hire more than one. But primarily, people hire foreign domestic workers because they are pressured to have higher and higher incomes, and a helper easily opens up the choice for dual income without sacrificing career prospects.
What Boudin is getting at here, to the discomfort of his esteemed guests, they seem so shook by what he's saying, is the reality of poor migrant labor, especially in the household, for instance. For a while, Singapore has had a fairly high Gini coefficient, which is a measurement of inequality, where the higher you are, the more unequal your country is. And that's something that can still apply today, despite reporting that they're more fair than OECD countries now. If you do the math of taxes and transfers like this Redditor did, it's kind of like, not great. In the book Class Inequality in the Global City, scholar Jun Jia-Ye writes, "For all its successes, Singapore demonstrates staggering contrasts of wealth, poverty, and power. It also relies on increasing numbers of foreign-born workers to do the jobs that locals cannot be persuaded to do."
So to start off, it is true that Singapore has a high reliance on low-income foreign workers. But that's a wrong use of the Gini coefficient. On the surface, using a statistic to talk about foreign worker inequality sounds correct, but Singapore's Gini coefficient is calculated using resident employed households, so that only counts Singaporeans and permanent residents. The point about high inequality in Singapore is somewhat kinda true. It's just not what Elliot Sang thinks it is, because the statistic is significant only for comparing Singaporeans. A point to bring up here could be about the media, how our statistics board cherry-pick data, and how our politicians choose to present it. But you can tell Elliot Sang didn't even bother reading the Reddit thread they linked because they said,
if you do the math of taxes and transfers like this Redditor did,
generally speaking, these kinds of government data are published in their final form rather than having those individual components and sources given so you can calculate yourself. You can't do the math because you don't have the data. Like in the case of Singapore's Gini coefficient, after adjusting for taxes, it's just given to us like this. If we scroll down further, we can find a comment that To correctly compare Gini coefficients, we have to use the square root scale to compare to the OECD. And because every country calculates that differently, we have to use alternative databases, like the one they got from Frederick Soot's database. Whether that is high or not, I leave it to your interpretation. Just know that this is compared with other high-income countries, and the database may not be very accurate in the first place because the collection of Gini coefficient data is not very standardized. Even in the case where migrant workers can be in the Gini coefficient, you have to first understand that the migrant worker population is dependent on policy and the demand and supply of the labor market. This means if you want to measure the inequality in your country, you have to ask, do you want your Gini coefficient to be highly volatile because of those random policy or market changes? I'm guessing not. You want to know the year-to-year changes of how much inequality changes for people that you know for sure will be staying in Singapore. There's no point if you see the Gini coefficient improve because that one particular year you hired 70,000 more migrant workers for industries that just happen to have higher pay, or if some industry had a bad year and migrant workers went back to their home countries. Should there be some kind of indicator for migrant workers? Sure. In the first place, migrant workers are very underrepresented in population statistics. But if you want to compare purely between migrant workers and the native population, the Gini coefficient ain't it.
Around 40% of the labor force in Singapore are migrant laborers, many of them construction workers or house workers. As analyzed by 3 writers for Continentalist, migrant workers often must take on serious debt, and their health and safety is in the hands of their employers, who can easily take advantage of these migrants' precarious situations. As a result, there's a high percentage of deaths and injuries among migrant workers.
Exact figures for migrant workers' injuries are not publicly available, but between 2014 and 2021, an average of 12,770 workers, including Singaporeans, were injured every year. Most of these occurred in construction and manufacturing.
And you might think, why don't they just use that brilliant legal system they got over there in Singapore to bring justice to these mean, evil people and make money and whatever? It's not going to work. It doesn't work all that often anyway. Oftentimes, migrants are actually forced to repatriate, meaning go back to their home country, but now with a ton of debt. For migrant house workers, usually women, domestic abuse is a particularly dangerous reality.
The case of Piang Ngai-don, a domestic worker who came from Myanmar to support her toddler son, shows what can happen in a system that concentrates power in the hands of an employer over an individual. Tied to window grills, starved, punched, burnt, and strangled, she lost half her body weight over the course of a year and died in 2016 at age 24. When seen by a doctor, her employer was able to play off Miss Piang's injuries as her being clumsy. Justice was finally served in 2021, when the employer was sentenced to 30 years imprisonment.
Okay, let's re-examine what Elliot Sang said in the last 5 minutes of their video. Whether unintentionally or purposefully, Elliot Sang didn't clarify that the 3 people in the Bodin clip were not the average representation of a Singaporean. They then showed an incorrectly used Gini coefficient chart, and to create that picture of inequality, said that there are a lot of migrant worker deaths and injuries because of
mean, evil people.
To finish off their point, they called the legal system useless, and to emphasize that, say that
domestic abuse is a particularly dangerous reality.
And without context, wrote down the case of a domestic worker who was murdered. And thus, they created a narrative that Singaporeans are rich, entitled people who exploit poorer foreign workers and are evil murderers who abuse their domestic helpers. Given that the title of their thumbnail is Ba Sing Se, I would say that this is a deliberate narrative. I mean, where do I even start? I guess the first thing to mention is, if you want to bring to light the dangerous reality of migrant worker injuries and death and the futility of the legal system, maybe don't use a case where the murderers got sentenced to imprisonment. I mean, a legal system can't prevent psychopaths from existing. Instead, use actual cases of exploitation and inequality, such as the case of migrant workers who turned to the NGO Transient Workers Count 2, TWC2. In one case, an injured migrant worker was forcibly removed from his dormitory and sent back to Bangladesh despite requiring medical treatment for a workplace injury. The employer's insurance should normally bear the cost of the treatment, but it was simply easier to replace the worker and the worker was sent home broken and indebted. Or you could talk about how the mediation process for salary disputes is skewed way too much on the side of employers, as workers have immense debt pressures and feel they need to expedite the process. This means employers can offer low settlements and hoped that workers would be desperate enough to accept. For instance, one worker was not only offered only 2,000 SGD out of his $10,000 claim, the settlement also asked him to return to the company that was committing wage theft on him. He was willing to take less than his full claim with the security of a transfer letter, but without that, he was left little choice but to go to the Employment Claims Tribunal, which is a far lengthier process. And during this process, he was unable to work, although his debt still must be paid. Cases like these are far more common and far more likely to be the kind of exploitation migrant workers face rather than the outlier of a murder. Elliot Sang didn't choose to talk about cases like these or why they happen, and it's probably a combination of shock value and laziness. But this is the same tactic commonly employed by conspiracy theorists and propagandists. They will just post the minority or queer or whoever they want to demonize doing some crime, completely without context, and leave the audience up to their imaginations. So let's go back to the sentence.
On serious debt, and their health and safety is in the hands of their employers, who can easily take advantage of these migrants' precarious situations. As a result, there's a high percentage of deaths and injuries among migrant workers.
We have established and agreed that migrant workers come to Singapore with debt and are heavily disadvantaged in the employee-employer relationship. But this is where the half-truth comes in. Notice how Elliot Sang uses the words, "as a result, there's a high percentage of deaths and injuries." Notice the framing where he puts all the blame on the employers and twisted the words of the article he was using. So let's read these 3 paragraphs together. On top of being low-waged and working in high-risk work environments, the ways in which the lives and rights of migrant workers are managed by employers and the state often puts them in a disempowered state. This goes beyond just their working rights and wages, but also includes core aspects of their lives, like how they sleep, eat, drink, and socialize, or their access to healthcare. This worsens during the pandemic, especially for workers living in dormitories. In a white paper published in 2023, the Singapore government acknowledged that they could have eased some of the restrictions earlier, and that not doing so had an impact on the mental health of workers. This isn't new or recent. Singapore has a fraught history in how it treats migrant labour. There is a tendency for Singaporeans to see migrant workers as others who warrant different treatment from them, not least because of policies and circumstances that keep apart the living and social spaces of migrant workers and locals. This separation creates gaps in understanding about the challenges these workers face. Moreover, there are 2 prevailing misguided narratives that tend to make discussions about migrant workers and their working conditions in Singapore difficult. The first is that their work is inherently dangerous, and workers knowingly subscribe to this risk in return for higher pay compared to what they would earn in their home countries. The second is that existing laws and policies are sufficient, and misadventures or cases of abuse are largely the fault of errant individual employers, or bad apples. Notice how Elliot Sang has purposefully removed the nuance in 3 well-written paragraphs and neglected to mention the legislation, the perceptions of migrant labour, the misguided narrative that migrant labour knew about the risk and reward of coming to Singapore, and the second misguided narrative that these cases are largely the fault of errant individual employers, or to put it another way, the article is saying that this doesn't happen just because mean, evil people exist. That previous TWC2 article also had more nuance to workplace safety. They recognized that injuries in the construction and marine shipyard industries are triple that of Singapore's average, with some of it inherent to the industry itself, but safety regulations are pretty high standards. The problem comes from organizational and individual failures to follow these regulations. From TWC2's anecdotal evidence, they think this could be due to workers influenced by debt and poor worker rights. They are in a perpetual state of uncertainty and can't focus, as worker treatment and stress directly relate to exhaustion, burnout, and injuries. Workers feel pressured to earn certain wages and push themselves to work more, which causes migrant workers to lose sleep and results in more injuries. Moreover, the high turnover rate of migrant workers results in an inexperienced, injury-prone workforce. So let's take a step back again and ask, why do migrant workers even come here with debt? The Continentalist essay that Elliot Sang linked says that they have to borrow massive amounts of money to come to Singapore, ranging from SGD 1,000 to 16,000, as they go through layers of middlemen recruitment agents who purport to cover essentials like flights and medical screenings. However, the article doesn't elaborate on these recruitment agents. Another article, Why Do Bangladeshis Choose to Work in Singapore by TWC2 again, illustrates the perspective of Ashit, a 25-year-old who had been working in Singapore for 7 years, and Lee Chong, a 23 years old and working for 3 years. Both of them had completed 12 years of education with a higher secondary school certificate or A-level equivalent in Bangladesh. They estimate that in their cohort, about 20% of the 100 students have left the country for employment abroad, as getting jobs in Bangladesh is difficult with money demanded from applicants. Quote, all jobs must pay, even government job, end quote. Typically, higher salaried jobs will have a higher asking price, but jobs are not chosen on merit, as it depends on who the boss likes and how much a prospective employee is willing to pay for the job. Finding a job is kinda like an investment to them, but even by investing, it is not guaranteed that you will get the job. Additionally, salaries in Bangladesh are so low that they may not be able to save up for anything. This is the reason why Bangladeshis look overseas for better opportunities, and as Ashit and Lee Chon shared proudly, that they have brothers, cousins and uncles working all over the world. The price to pay for coming to Singapore is about 11 lakh, or about 13.6 thousand SGD. In comparison, the UAE or Malaysia only requires about 3 lakhs, or just less than 4,000 SGD. Despite these expensive prices, Singapore and Japan are the top spots and have long waiting times for employment processing, with the interviewees remarking that friends told him Singapore has good regulations and that Japan has the best salary. As Alex, the vice president of TWC2, points out, the ranking given by the interviewees suggests that their opinions are formed by word of mouth. For instance, South Korea is similarly safe and has good salaries, yet it is ranked at the bottom of their preferences. This isn't to completely wash Singapore's hands off being complicit in the market of exploiting low-wage migrant workers, but Singapore is not responsible for the economic conditions of a country much larger than it is. Singapore also cannot control the market of buying and selling jobs outside of the city, and neither can Singapore control how normalized these markets are in other countries. Singapore is not Ba Sing Se, where the city serves as the capital of a larger kingdom, and it does not have the authority to do so. To understand the agent fee problem, this research report by TWC2 and Injustice in Migrant Worker Recruitment Fees explains. Recruitment costs charged to low-wage migrant workers are often exorbitant and artificially inflated by recruiters, job agencies, other intermediaries, and employers who may profit from the recruitment process, with practices of purchasing jobs, extorting kickbacks, and profit-making from the recruitment process commonly reported. Many workers are left heavily in debt, consequently becoming entrapped in their jobs under adverse terms for extended periods and thus becoming more susceptible to further workplace abuse and exploitation. This isn't just a Singapore issue, it's an issue globally. These fees facilitate abusive practices and rights violations, and despite current regulations including a fee cap, research suggests that this is commonly flouted by Singapore agencies. In addition to being more likely to take on overtime work past legal limits and the fear of dismissal that we already discussed, the report suggests that the current system makes it easy for intermediaries, including employers, to extort kickbacks and profit from a lack of transparency in supply chains. The lack of regulation and the lucrative benefits of cost extraction incentivizes rent seeking. Additionally, these practices have an effect on the labour market in Singapore. They create inefficiencies due to the artificial price floor, shutting out potential experienced migrant workers who are unable to afford or unwilling to pay recruitment fees. Jobs are given to the highest bidders instead of the most suitable workers. This also means that there are elevated levels of turnover of workers and lower productivity. Another effect, as highlighted in a speech given by TWC2, is that unethical employers tend to have a competitive advantage with the ability to bid lower to win contracts due to their lower labour cost. Regulatory neglect and poor enforcement of laws have also allowed unlicensed cowboy agents to grab more and more market share. At the end of the day, ethical employers, in order to compete, have to either lose out or adapt worker policies to become more like unethical employers. So finally, with proper context, and I still have not elaborated on why Singapore needs migrant workers in the first place, we can finally talk about death and injury rate. Using data from the ILO Stat Explorer, we then filter the data to find the latest injury and death statistic for each country. We are using total injuries and deaths instead of only migrant workers because a lot of countries don't split their data that way for analysis. Based on the non-fatal injuries per 100,000 workers, out of 82 countries, Singapore is ranked quite in the middle, at 43rd with 613 injuries. For comparison, Japan is 55th with 266 injuries, and the United States is 33rd with 900 injuries. For fatal injuries, Singapore is ranked 62nd out of 81 countries, with 1.3 deaths out of 100,000 people, compared to Japan at 58th and 1.4 deaths, and the United States at 5.25 deaths. Something interesting I noticed while skimming the data is that the United States, unlike other countries, does not count individual cases, but instead chooses to round the numbers to the nearest 100. Ironic for a country known for its individualism. Anyway, using the data in context, we can see that Singapore is neither a shining example nor an extremely terrible example in terms of workplace injuries. And yes, most of the people taking on the more dangerous jobs in Singapore are going to be migrant workers, but it's not like Singaporeans deliberately made it so that migrant workers are going to get injured. It is a combination of a lot of factors including regulation, mismatch of skills, the economics and grey market of the labour market, and a lot of other things. Singaporeans can and do also get hurt and injured. So, after putting the misleading statistic, Elliot Sang then puts the case of Piang Ngai Don, which we have first established is for shock value and maybe some kind of propaganda. I could, for instance, do the complete opposite and say that foreign domestic workers are violent as shown by these cases where domestic workers pinched a 3-year-old, kicked a special needs child, or dipped the toddler's hand in boiling water. We can easily flip the narrative, but looking at these kind of cases is just not very helpful in understanding the root problem. Even if we ignore the bad faith argument and simply take it at face value for discussion, the social issues of foreign domestic workers working in Singapore have a very different set of complications from other migrant workers. Their working conditions are different, the agencies they go through are different, the countries they come from are different, thus giving us a whole new range of economies and politics to figure out why these things happen. Properly figuring out every one of these things will make this video 5 hours long. So let's read the maid abuse section in the Migrant Death Map website, which is just about the shortest thing you can read to gain an understanding. Although, I have to point out they also do the shock value thing by emphasizing the deaths first. Here's the crux of the problem. Employers are entrusted under current regulations to ensure the well-being of FDWs. But those same regulations also empower them with a large degree of discretionary power to interpret the guidelines themselves, leaving room for wildly varied levels of compliance. The absence of fixed working hours and separate housing for FDWs allows employers to deny off days and limit overall freedom of movement, withhold mobile devices, passports and work permits, overwork FDWs, and subject them to greater instances of abuse. The article recognizes that it is not possible to end domestic work as an occupation, as many countries have a GDP that depends greatly on remittances from their citizens who work abroad. According to the Philippine Central Bank, Filipinos working overseas sent home a record $31.4 billion in cash remittances in 2021, which was integral to helping the Philippines recover economically from the pandemic. Singapore is the second largest source of remittances after the US. And I hope you aren't gonna be like, hey, I'm just saying the same thing that Singapore exploits migrant workers. Because the narrative that Elliot Sang paints is just that, a narrative. Migrant workers are exploited, Singapore is evil, you can't change evil. While the sources I quoted give specific reasons that hope to improve the lives of migrant workers in very specific ways. Manual labour migrant workers have poor safety despite high regulation standards. Let's do something about the agency market. Let's make sure good employees don't get priced out by unethical employers. Foreign domestic workers have terrible working conditions because of living with their employers. Let's give them day offs and separate housing. What we should learn from the gruesome deaths and injury statistics isn't some call to look up mean, evil people and to continue doom scrolling, but to improve the working conditions of people migrating to work here and treat them more like workers rather than disposable cheap labor.
Social reification, which is when something in society is made up but then becomes real. Something like that. I'm really good at philosophy. Social reification allows for and reinforces these inequalities.
I mean, with this kind of explanation, you might as well don't even use the term. Whatever this term means is not going to affect Elliot Sang's argument, so go ahead and skip it if you don't want to learn about this. So, disclaimer, not a sociologist, I just read and summarize and oversimplify. The literal translation of reification, as in the original Latin word, is to make a thing. And the definition is used in the sense of turning something abstract into a thing. So, say, money is a made-up concept in a human mind, but we turn it into an object in the form of a physical note or gold or just numbers on a screen. Even something like citizenship is made up, so before Singapore's independence, there was no such thing as a Singaporean, but then a group of people made up that concept, and as time went by, we associate more and more different things with what it means to be a Singaporean. And by doing that, we are making this Singaporean identity a thing. Social reification is a theory that describes the turning of relationships between humans into things. Not, as Elliot Sang says, allows for and reinforces it. Emphasize again, it is a theory describing it, not the mechanism itself. Just because some Hungarian guy made a theory about something doesn't mean that Singaporeans just started to robotically think.
I am going to turn all my relationships into transactions.
That's like saying Newton invented gravity, and that before he wrote down the equations, people were just floating around. Ironically, Elliot Sang has reified reification, a reification fallacy of mistaking the map as the territory itself. Anyway, the description of this process is usually used as a criticism of capitalism, as it turns ideas of what it means to be a human being into an object. So, someone who is, say, good with medicine and treating patients is primarily seen as a doctor under the system of capitalism. They are a thing, as in a unit of labor in the labor force of medical staff, and they are prescribed a monetary value that way. In the ultimate form of this reification process, humans become more and more machine-like, and human relationships simply become things that are associated with each other. So, for example, a hospital, which has the abstract idea of saving lives and helping people, is turned into the calculation of profits and losses or some kind of KPI, or something cultural like authentic ethnic food, which is normally abstract and has so many meanings that can come from how the recipe has evolved over time, when how the ingredients are cultivated, the people that made it, and so many other factors, is made into something and sold at, say, $30 in a restaurant. So that was probably way too long for just 2 sentences that Elliot Sang said, but if you want to learn more, search for George Lukács.
Lee Kuan Yew's dominant ideology has had this impact where people assume that if you're not doing well in life, then you always had a chance and you still have a chance. And if you don't get to a better place, then that's on you. You didn't work hard enough. And so if I'm doing well, I deserve that position. For instance, Singapore is often described as meritocratic, a meritocracy, because of things like its well-acclaimed education system, which we talked about in a previous video about how school is bad, because we do stuff like that on this channel. When we talked to our friends in Singapore, we came to the conclusion that it's actually pretty brutal. Like, the education system is quite brutal there, and yes, of course, not everybody who succeeds in it deserved to succeed.
To say the least, it fucking sucked ass.
These attitudes are dangerous. When such attitudes become prevalent, they mean harm for people who don't have a fair shot in life. For instance, disabled people or poor people, especially in a situation like the ongoing COVID-19 pandemic.
It's true that the education system is brutal, and it's true that Singapore puts a high level of personal responsibility on people, but it's such a weird thing to say that Lee Kuan Yew had his impact that made Singaporeans think a certain way. It's not passing say where people are brainwashed, but something more cultural. So the first thing to clarify is that the dominant mindset isn't eugenics, it's pragmatism. Due to the circumstances surrounding our independence and the economic realities, our politicians tend to see Singapore as very vulnerable. Like, as shown in this paper, we were small, No resources, no hinterland, no ethnic harmony, and potentially surrounded by hostile neighbors. And honestly, if Singapore just disappeared tomorrow, nobody would give a shit. Like, holy shit, we don't even have the guarantee of water until like less than 15 years ago. Our neighbors keep doing things like threatening to cut the water or do a military exercise called Total Wipeout, super close to Singapore, while it was our national day and when we were changing the Prime Minister. And the way to solve all that is to become so economically relevant on the international level that other countries are also somewhat interested in our survival. And after achieving that, you can say that we don't have those threats now, but there's no evidence to tell if that will still be the case if Singapore isn't as powerful economically and militarily today. Though the personal responsibility thing reminds me of something Taman says in the 45th St. Gordon Symposium, so I'll play the clip. It's quite long if you have no patience and think it's not relevant.
I think we're a very interesting case of a country that has low government spending, by the way, by most standards, as a percentage of GDP, low taxes.
Well, as long as your GDP keeps climbing.
Yes, but our starting point is not a bad one. We've got relatively low government spending and revenues, but we are able to achieve the social outcomes that countries with much larger spending do. And how do we do it? I think one of the very important lessons of the last 50 years is that traditional concepts of welfare and social expenditure and government intervention have led to a weakening of private initiative and personal responsibility. Not because that was the intent. It never was the intent. It was never the social democratic intent to weaken private initiative and family responsibility. I mean, look at the Scandinavian countries. They used to be amongst the most hardworking countries in the world. The Swedes were incredibly hardworking, industrious people.
You're using past tense, are you? Have Swedes become lazy, or what's
present active tense. They're a good society in many ways, so I didn't mean to.
Well, Swedes will get the chance to comment on this in a moment.
They're a good society in many ways. They're willing to pay high taxes to keep their system going. But the point is, there are ways in which an active government can intervene to support social mobility, to develop opportunities, and to take care of the old, which doesn't undermine personal and family responsibility. And that's the compact that we are trying to achieve. It's almost a paradox.
You mean you're a bit more ruthless? Is that what you're saying?
No, we are achieving a paradox of active government support for personal responsibility, rather than active government support to take over personal responsibility or community responsibility.
Do you believe in the concept of a safety net?
So we believe in a concept of support for you taking up opportunities. So we don't have unemployment.
I believe in the sometimes simplicity of yes or no answers. What about this idea of a safety net? Do you believe? Does Singapore believe in the notion of a safety net for those who fall between the cracks of a successful economy?
I believe in the notion of a trampoline.
Yeah. So people are just bouncing up and down in Singapore.
No, I mean, it boils down to what policies you're talking about. If you provide help for someone who's willing to study in education, to study hard, if you provide help for someone who's willing to take up a job and work at it, and make life not so easy if you stay out of work. If you provide help for someone who wants to own a home, and we are very generous in our grants for home ownership, which is why we have 90% home ownership. And amongst the low-income population, more than 80% own their homes. It transforms culture. It's not just about transactions. It's not about the size of grant. It's about keeping alive a culture where I feel proud that I own my home and I earn my own success through my job. I feel proud that I'm raising my family.
It is a
keeping that culture going is what keeps a society vibrant.
So I hope you can tell from what he's saying that there is always a mentality of constantly improving and going upwards with a lot of personal responsibility involved. Tharman avoids talking about it, but this also results in the pressure cooker society we currently live in. Proud to own a home, for instance, can also be an euphemism for saying that you are